So, buona tarde. So I do understand Catalan now that I've been hearing it, but thank you very much for turning the language switch. It made it easier for me. So thank you very much, Minister Gelli and Rector Tobeya, and thank you very much, Manuel. He's one of the scientists from the other side of the sciences that has made better contact with neuroscience, and it's wonderful to have him as a great colleague and as a friend. So thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here in Barcelona. It's a city that I very much love. I've been coming to Barcelona for something like 35 years, which means I started very young, of course, and it's always a pleasure to be here. So the title of my lecture, and we can project the title right now, is Brain and Mind from Medicine to Society. And it might be a strange title if you had not had the introduction you just heard, which makes it, I think, even more palatable immediately. But it's a title that has quite a lot of meaning. We all know that research on brain and mind, whether from cognitive science or from neuroscience in strict terms, has had a major impact in medicine. Obviously, everybody knows that what we have gathered in neuroscience, especially in the past 20 years, is of great importance to understand conditions such as Parkinson's disease, architecture and urban planning, to something that is broader in terms of the intellectual extension. And I think that the route to that extension actually is going to be, and is already being, from emotion research. What I would like to do today is talk a little bit about what has happened, especially in the past 10 years, from my point of view, in neuroscience of emotion, where it fits, and what are the possibilities. So I will deal with facts, and then at the end, we'll deal a little bit with dreams as well. So the first thing is to talk about the century of neglect. How do you say century? Siglo? The century of neglect that emotion research has had. It's very intriguing because anyone that knows the history of this matter, you could say, well, research on emotion starts with Aristotle, and you can go back to a variety of major philosophers that were very preoccupied with emotion. But certainly, by the end of the 19th century, there are three key figures that had a huge role in this research. The most central one for me is William James, and we will talk a little bit more about William James in a minute. But of course, even before James, there was Darwin, and Darwin was extremely preoccupied from a point of view of general biology with the emotions. And a little after James, there was also Freud, who, in spite of the fact that he has a less than perfect reputation these days, did quite a lot of research in this area and quite a lot of brilliant thinking that, in fact, remains quite modern. For reasons that I won't go into, because that's not the lecture I'm giving today, all of this enormous success in dominating issues at the end of the 19th century was cut short in the 20th century. And for some reason, or for many reasons, both in neuroscience but elsewhere, emotion was really given the cold shoulder and was not treated as a central issue. And the 20th century really becomes a century of rationalism, with the shunning of emotion quite clearly, and certainly the shunning of emotion in the world of neuroscience. It's quite intriguing to think that, I'm sure that many of you in the audience are biologists and probably neuroscientists, some of you, and you know that the Society for Neuroscience, which is the largest group of neuroscientists in the world, and which now brings tens of thousands every year together, and started in 1971, only had a symposium on emotion in 1995. So it really took that long for emotion to catch and emotion caught on precisely in the 1990s. And that symposium in 1995 was organized by me and by Joseph Ledoux, and until then, the society had not even had a session that dealt with the topic of emotion. The themes were very different. And of course, a good part of this comes from the fact that in mid-century, we had something that we now call the cognitive revolution, which is in fact 50 years old. If we date it from the famous work of Noam Chomsky and his first well-known publication in 1957, we can say that this revolution of cognitive science happened 50 years ago, happened in the middle of the century. And what we are going through now and began in the 1990s is really something you could call an emotion revolution. And it's not that you're going to throw away what was acquired in the cognitive revolution. It's just that you're going to put things in a slightly different perspective, and it's time to give emotion its due, even in terms of the reasoning process. In other words, the idea that somehow emotion is inferior to reason and to rationality is, of course, ludicrous. It's not correct. You have to remember that the first mechanism of rationality available to living creatures was, in fact, emotion. Creatures have been emoting and taking decisions that are extremely advantageous and extremely rational on the basis of emotion. And what has happened is that, fortunately for us, we have multiple routes. You could say that you have both fast and slow routes. You have a fast route of decisions that really comes from emotional responses that are biologically entrenched and very powerful. And you have a combination of routes that involves reasoning in the traditional sense, and that, in fact, is very importantly enmeshed with emotion. And so you have this other way of dealing with reasoning, but it's not that one is opposed to the other. So the impact that this emotion revolution has in medicine and society is quite remarkable. And as I said, it's going to be more and more so, both in terms of medical diseases. For example, what we've learned, even in 10 years about emotion, is absolutely critical for the way we deal with, for example, stroke rehabilitation. Of course, we hope that with modern medicine and with the biology that informs medicine, there will come a time in which maybe nobody will have a stroke, and we can prevent it through a variety of ways, all the way into the most modern aspects of molecular biology. But the fact is that in the meantime, many people will have stroke and damage caused by stroke, and knowing about how the emotional system works is actually a key to the rehabilitation that people with stroke will have to have. And we know that one of the most dramatic conditions and most important causes of suffering for humanity are actually mood disorders, for example, depression. And emotion research is actually a key to the understanding of depression and even to the treatment of depression. For example, there is a very recent development in terms of the use of implanted electrodes in the treatment of refractory depression, the kind of depression that will not respond to anything, will not respond to medication, will not respond to shock therapy, and that can be alleviated with the passing of an electrical current in certain parts of the brain. But the interesting thing is that the parts of the brain that need to be affected were discovered through research on the emotions. So there's a practical medical importance that is without question. But clearly the most interesting thing for me, because it's new, the other one is part of the long tradition of medicine, is the application in the social space. And there, as I will tell you towards the end, we have a possibility of understanding, for example, how we produce moral behavior, which is entirely tied to the emotional system and to its evolutionary history. We have the possibility of understanding, for example, what we, as Homo economicus, do in terms of our relationships to markets and the way even in which we carry out financial decisions. We have a way of understanding the biology that is behind justice systems. Think, for example, of what goes on when we engage in electing a public official through the process of elections and have to do sometimes these very curious binary decisions that will allow you to elect Monsieur Sarkozy or Madame Royale. That's all, for example, what happens in the jury system when we as jurors in a trial have to decide yes or no if Mr. So-and-so is guilty or not guilty. Those kinds of decisions, which of course in an ideal world, or maybe not so ideal, would be carried out purely in terms of rational process, in terms of knowledge, of facts and logic, we very much know that that's not the case, and that emotional processes have an immense role to play. And we're not going to eradicate emotion from human beings. What we need is to know more about how emotion plays as a factor in all those decisions. So, and then, of course, there is a very interesting world in which things actually fuse, both medical and they have to do with social ills. For example, in problems such as drug addiction, or in problems like, for example, violence, or the problem of conflict resolution. Those can be illuminated by the research that one does in this area. So now let me go through a number of facts, and I will tell my story as rapidly as possible around one question, actually two questions. One, what is an emotion? And the other, what is a feeling? And I'm going to try to give answers to those questions, obviously because I don't believe that an emotion and a feeling are one and the same thing, although very often they are confused. And I will tell you, in trying to give the answer, about a variety of advances that have occurred and make a summary of them. The first one has to do with redefining emotion by amplifying the description of emotion phenotypes. Now, everyone, if I ask you, tell me an example of an emotion, you're probably going to give me an example coming from one of those top emotions, the so-called primary emotions. You're going to tell me about fear or anger, happiness, sadness, or disgust. Those are the most likely ones. And of course they are emotions, without a doubt, and they are emotions that were actually very well studied by people like Darwin and have now been found to be universal. They can be found in people of every kind of culture, even in cultures that do not have a name to go with the emotion. They have the behavior that eventually was named fear or anger. Now, the interesting thing is that there are two additional tiers of emotion that are now being literally understood and have been added to the list of possible phenotypes. One is background emotions. This is something that we added in the early 1990s, and they include emotions such as enthusiasm and discouragement, which are very important and which we have every day of our lives, and which are in fact the most common emotional states in which we tend to be. Fortunately for us, most of our time, our emotional time, is not spent in fear or anger or in sadness or even in happiness. We spend it with modulations of discouragement or enthusiasm from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep. And one thing that is very interesting is that we are always in an emotional state, which is something that people don't realize, and that people tend to think of emotions as something that is punctate, something that comes like this and goes away, and then you go back to some kind of neutrality. Well, the only state of neutrality in which you are without emotions are the states in which you are also not conscious. So people that are comatose or in vegetative state or in the middle of an epileptic crisis very often do not have emotions and have neutral states of emotion. And that's very bad. It's not something to be recommended by any rate. Otherwise, you're always in some kind of emotion, and the most common states are some kind of background emotion, like enthusiasm or discouragement. The other thing that is very important is this new group of emotions that for a while people that maybe in the audience that read my work, I used to call them secondary emotions. And then we changed and we started calling them social emotions, which not only connects with the literature in psychology of certain kinds of emotion, but it's actually the way of calling the thing by what it is. It's emotions such as compassion or sympathy, shame, contempt, embarrassment, pride, the sense of awe and admiration. These are emotions that are, or jealousy for that matter, or envy, emotions that are entirely tied to the fact that we live in society and that we have others towards whom we can react with those emotions, and we can even react with them in relation to ourselves, such as, for example, with guilt, but always in relation to something that happened in the duality with another person or with another group. Now, these emotions used to be thought as something purely cultural. It used to be thought that children, through parenting and through schools, would learn about what is it that they should be ashamed of or embarrassed by or contemptuous of or admiring of. And the fact is that this is not quite so. Without a doubt, education has a huge importance in the way these emotions are tuned. It's certainly part of what the educational system will do, whether somebody will end up admiring good actions or bad actions. That's part of the education system. But the fact that we have this ability to admire and to be in awe of certain things, or we have the ability to have compassion for people who are suffering, or even for non-humans who are suffering, that is something that is as much a part of our biological endowment as it is to have a reaction of fear. So these are emotions that are part of our natural human makeup. They're part of the equipment with which we are born, and they are transmitted by the genome as much as the color of our eyes is transmitted by the genome. And then, of course, culture has a huge role to play in directing how those emotions are going to be applied. Are you going to be in fear of somebody that is of a different race, or are you going to be in fear of airplanes or in fear of heights? Those are very different things, and the culture has a lot to do with how the fear ends up being applied. But to begin with, the culture doesn't teach you how to have those emotions. They're part of your equipment. And by the way, if somebody says, how on earth do you know that this is biological? Do you have genes to prove that they are biological? Well, actually, it is beginning to be the case that we will have evidence from the genome. But the most important thing is that research in animals, research, for example, in primatology, shows very clearly that a number of these emotions are present. In fact, when you look at reactions in primates, all the way from monkeys who have a sense of justice and who will reject unfair behaviors, to, of course, chimpanzees who will behave with full compassion in relation to not only conspecifics, but also to other species. For example, a chimpanzee can behave in a compassionate way towards a small human, a baby that is suffering. So these actually go across species and are not even confined purely in a selfish way to the same species. So the expansion towards background emotions and social emotions is extremely important. Another kind of advance that has taken place has to do with how we understand the physiology of the emotion-feeling cycle. And I want to say a few words about that. And I'm going to go back, as I said, to William James, because William James contributed something very important in terms of an insight into emotion, although at the same time he made a huge mistake in terms of the language, which got him into a lot of trouble and got many people into a lot of trouble. So I'm going to read to you, or you can read, this sentence which comes straight out of James, 1884, in his seminal paper on emotion, and which says that our natural way of thinking about these emotions is that the mental perception of some facts excites the mental affection called the emotion, and that this latter state of mind gives rise to the bodily expression. That was before James. My thesis, James's thesis, on the contrary, is that the bodily changes follow directly from the perception. You perceive something that ought to cause fear in you, and it immediately causes, according to James, after the perception, a bodily change, and the perception of the exciting fact, and our feeling of the same changes as they occur is the emotion. By the way, James wrote it precisely this way. The word perception and the word is were emphasized and were in bold in the paper. That's not my emphasis. So what James did here was something very interesting, which can be summarized in the following way. Number one, he inverted the traditional sequence of events in the emotional process. He said clearly, things go to some kind of bodily reaction, and then there is this understanding of what is going on. And that's very important, and in fact, that is entirely borne out by the research, and that's the great insight of William James. Then he interposed the body between the causative stimulus and the experience of emotion, which is, of course, very important too, because for a long time prior to brain science, and even after brain science began, people were separating body and brain as if they could do that. In fact, you can't, because we live as creatures. We live in the brain that lives within a body, and that body is entirely represented in the brain, so that everything that is happening in our mind, and is of course happening in the brain, is related to body processes, either directly so or simulated in the brain, because the brain has the ability, for reasons that have to do with engineering control of our physiology, has the ability to map the entire body in all its departments and to even run simulations on what is going on within the body. So interposing the body was a critical step. Third, he left out, and that's not so good, the idea that there was an appraisal of the stimulus. So the idea that you perceive something and you go directly into a body state is not 100% correct. It happens a lot of the time, especially if you're dealing with something that is very powerful, like fear, and of course most of this thinking for James took place in the setting, the context of fear, but this does not happen all the time. And the final and critical problem is the number 4, which is that he conflated emotion and feeling. So he starts out by giving the impression that emotion is a variety of behaviors, of reactions, but then he ends up saying that the impression that we get, the perception that we get of all those changes is the emotion, and of course he conflates the two, and it is actually because of that, and that's another story by itself, that in the early 20th century, a number of physiologists were able to find a lot of inconsistencies in James's thinking, and in fact sort of shut down Jamesian thinking for a long time. But so what I want to tell you is that, in my view, emotion and feeling are in fact two separable processes. They have a sequence and an order. Emotion comes first. Feelings are always perceptions of what you emoted. So they have that precedence, which is inevitable. And whereas emotion, as I will tell you in a second, is an action program with some cognitive components, a feeling is always cognition over what has happened in emotion. So let me explain that to you in detail. So first, a definition of emotion that I can be satisfied and Hannah can be satisfied with, and it's something that every year we revise, we add a word, take a word, and this one is very good for 2007. So it says, human emotions are largely unlearned programs of automatic actions and cognitive strategies aimed at the management of life. And every word counts in this very simple definition. First, the point that they are largely unlearned. They're not 100% unlearned, but mostly unlearned. It's something that you get, and that matures the way you mature if your brain is normal. Second, they are automatic. So you can have a measure of control of the emotions, but not 100% control. For example, even in cultures that wish to suppress emotion at the level of facial expressions, there are many other things that the emotion consists of in relation to visceral expressions that go on under the face that may look like a mask, what we call in American English a poker face. So you cannot suppress it completely. And then all of these actions, all of these programs that we are born to do, to carry out under certain circumstances, are aimed at the management of life. And this is very important because you might say, well, but what are these things for? What are emotions for? Is this some kind of luxury that you can use or not use? Can you do without emotions? And the answer is absolutely not. Emotions have an evolutionary reason. They were added to the machine over millions of years of evolution precisely to carry out a role. And for any emotion that you can think of, ask yourself if you call it an emotion, if it has anything to do with helping the management of life, either directly for the self or for the group that the individual belongs to. And if it doesn't do some kind of helping job in terms of management of life, it's probably not an emotion, it's something else. It could be an interesting cognitive adaptation, but not necessarily an emotion. Point number 2, emotions are triggered by what we like to call emotionally competent stimuli. That is, objects or situations that can be real out in front of you or be in your mind when you think and you recall, and they act on brain devices that were designed by evolution. So in order to create an emotion, either with your eyes closed and thinking about a particular problem, or with your eyes and ears open to what is going on in the world, you need a stimulus. And the stimulus has a certain range, and certain stimuli can cause happiness, and some stimuli can cause sadness or compassion. And that's the way it is designed. There is a fundamental reaction that is triggered by one of those structures of the brain, and the structures are so conserved that, in fact, they're the same across many species. So, for example, a structure that I will tell you about called the amygdala, which is a structure that you find in the human brain. And you can see it, you can see an amygdala here with damage caused by a disease, and the amygdala here in the intact state. This is a three-dimensional reconstruction of a brain done with magnetic resonance, and it comes from Hannah's lab. And that amygdala is present in many other species. For example, we know what happens to that amygdala in rodents. You can study it in the mouse, you can study it in the rat, and you can study it in monkeys as well. And that structure does fundamentally the same range of reactions that it does in a human being. Of course, the behaviors are simpler, the cognition is simpler in those species, but the basics of that operation is the same. So this is one of the important structures that helps to trigger an emotion given the right emotionally competent stimulus. And the emotionally competent stimulus to cause fear, which is what the amygdala is mostly concerned with, and both in the case of the amygdala and in the case of the ventromedial frontal lobe, the way we discovered that these were very important trigger points for emotions came from the fact that if you have damage in this territory, or like in the previous one, if you have damage here, you do not have impairments of general cognition. You can be intelligent, you can have normal language, motor system, and so on, but you have a defect that pertains to a particular class of emotions. So in fact, you have a result of a lesion, which is very much like, for those of you who do not work in systems in humans, it's very much like a knockout experiment in mice, in which you remove one part and you see what the result is, and you come up with a range of hypotheses about what is really going on. The kind of damage that you see presented there produces a very different sort of emotional defect. It has to do with the social emotions. So, for example, the emotion of compassion is removed from the repertoire of behavior if you have damage in that territory. And that was a very important insight. So there are a variety of, over the past 10 years, a variety of regions that we know can be involved in triggering these emotions. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you have the list there in front of you, and the 4 that are on top are probably the principal ones. And it includes the amygdala, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate, and the anterior insula, which is a territory that is involved with disgust, which is a very, very critical and biologically extremely relevant emotion, because it began by having to do with a rejection of abnormal proteins that could potentially poison you. But then the other areas lower down also can function as trigger of certain aspects of emotion. And the way we can summarize in a lot of the research on triggering execution of emotion over the past 10 years is in this diagram in which you have 4 different levels of process from the cognitive standpoint, and 4 sets of structures that are involved in creating those stages. So you have the appraisal of the stimulus, the triggering of the emotion, the execution of the emotion, finally the emotional state. And here you have the structures that are involved. For example, in order to trigger, you need structures like the amygdala or the ventromedial or one of the others. But to execute, you need structures that are all subcortical, and eventually you end up creating an emotional state, which in the most plain mode of creating an emotion is a set of changes that occur in the internal milieu, which you could describe in general as the internal chemistries that are within your body, but also expresses itself in skeletal muscle, like, for example, in facial expression or in body posture, and express themselves in the viscera, say heart rate or tone of the gut, and in specific behaviors. So all of that is what creates the emotional state. Now, let me move on to say that the execution of the emotion can be carried out in the body proper, but also in part in the central nervous system, because in the central nervous system, at least in humans, we know that for sure, and I have no reason to doubt in animals as well, as you have an emotion, you also have a variety of changes in cognitive resources. For example, the way you pay attention to stimuli when you are having an emotion. If you are in a state of fear, you do not attend to the world the way you attended before the reaction. That cognitive resource changes. Your learning system changes as well. If you are in the middle of a Great Depression and you're sad, you do not attend to the world in the same way. And likewise, the style of your cognition changes. You change the way, for example, the ability to create new images in your brain, which is, of course, essential to the process of thinking, the process of imagination, the process of creation of something new, and even the